to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today's episode is the first of three in which we consider openings from Beethoven sonatas. The sonatas hold a special and permanent place in pianistic training and performance, not only because of their variety and complexity, but also because of their timeless beauty and appeal. Furthermore, I firmly believe that his sonatas brought the technique of playing the piano to a much higher level than it had previously required in history. And this extension of technique forces us as pianists to work very hard to meet Beethoven's requirements. All that being said, I'm actually going to focus on an element of performance which is based entirely in a realm which ignores technique as an endpoint. With the sonatas, we are, for the most part, telling a story that Beethoven has contrived. Getting all the right notes is useless if we don't consider our own storytelling technique and how this technique affects how the piece can be perceived by an audience. One of the most difficult elements of performance occurs when we must begin the piece. Today, we'll look at conventional openings, because once we understand these, then we can move on to less conventional and downright confusing openings. The opening of Opus 2 No. 3 in C major can be viewed as somewhat traditional in the classical sonata realm. Why can this be viewed as conventional? Well, Beethoven establishes his key of C major immediately. The first four bars harmonically move 1 to 5 to 1. This is the most efficient reinforcement that exists in tonal harmony. He reinforces this key of C major in the following bars as well. And when we reach the fortissimo bravura section, there is no doubt what key the sonata is in. This issue of setting the key is extremely important, because when we listen to a sonata, we need a frame of reference in order to understand intellectually and emotionally what happens when Beethoven breaks that frame. If we don't know that the piece is in C major, then modulations that happen harmonically have no impact psychologically aside from the surface level of understanding. In other words, the development section may sound lovely, but that will be the extent of our listening experience. This opening is not only clear harmonically, he also sets the atmosphere of the piece in a way that does not pose questions regarding the aesthetic and character. Due to the articulations and slurs, the soft opening comes across as being light and jocular, reminiscent of a person laughing softly to themselves. The fortissimo is a contrast to this, but not so much in intention as in demonstration. Instead of something light and jocular, we have something heroic and exuberant. In terms of the overall effect, we have a unified character that is, in simplified terms, happy. Now, why is this important? Establishing a character in a piece allows the composer to then contrast against that character, or show us how the character can change through development. This is not something that is limited to Beethoven's writing style. Contrast and change are universal techniques in music, and differences in composers can be readily identified by precisely how they use contrast and change. As a performer, we have the added responsibility to sell to the audience the differences in character, and to exaggerate at times in order for the changes to be easily identifiable. The difficulty is in choosing what we exaggerate and what we keep hidden. In a conventional opening by Beethoven, we don't have to sell the key of the piece. It's so well reinforced that it's not necessary for us to beat the audience over the head with it. Similarly, we don't have to sell the audience on the character of the piece either. If we follow the score as written, the character tends to appear without much prompting. Essentially, it's music that works automatically. Remember this point. One element of automatic interpretation that Beethoven builds into his works involves rhythmic or gestural contrast. In the C major sonata, there is a rhythmic pattern of slow, then fast, then medium. This appears in much of the opening material. The contrast occurs when we hit the bravura section just after. Our impression of contrast in this piece is built from whole sections which are different dynamically and in terms of character. If we consider the sonata in E major, Opus 14 number 1, we find a different approach to creating contrast. This opening is standard harmonically like the C major sonata, but notice here that it is the gestural and rhythmic differences, not dynamic, that create the impression of contrast. We have the static and almost vertical impression to begin and set the key. Then we have figurations, which are much more energetic and horizontal in motion, leading to stepwise gestures rather than the chordal ones we saw at the beginning. Aside from the marking of piano in the first bar of the piece, there is no indication for dynamic change until after we revisit the opening theme. The impression of contrast is created through subtle means in this piece, and it is up to us as interpreters to decide whether or not to infuse the music with dynamic and sound quality change to match the subtle nature, or if we should make things appear more obvious and on the surface. Let me explain. Earlier I had talked about the ideas of exaggerating a character or keeping it hidden. In the C major sonata I played at the beginning, the character was very clearly defined, and therefore there is only one level of decision-making involved. Do I play it as is, or do I exaggerate it? Given Beethoven's markings, it makes sense to lean towards the side of exaggerating the character, because exuberance and happiness is by nature expressed not as a subtle hint, but as a ruckus exclamation. If we decide not to exaggerate the character, the opening will still clearly communicate its intentions to the audience. It just may sound a little reserved. In the E major sonata, however, we have a situation where all of the actions are subdued by the dynamic indication of piano combined with the subtle changes which occur rhythmically and gesturally. This is not a piece that can sustain the material being announced proudly to the masses. It is one where we must pull the audience into our sphere of relaxed, intimate conversation. We must therefore consider two layers of decision-making. The first layer is the same as before, determining if we should play the music as written or exaggerate the details. The C major sonata opening will capture the audience's attention and communicate successfully, regardless of if it's exaggerated or not. The E major sonata will not work unless we carefully adjust our exaggerations in order to get the audience to listen carefully. Therefore, we have our second layer of decision-making, that of making an educated guess about the listening and comprehension level of our audience, and fine-tuning our interpretation in order to maximize the results. How do we do this? Well, let's go back to the thought process I mentioned earlier. The expression in this opening is, by nature, subtle. Therefore, we can either play towards the realm of subtlety, or we can play towards the realm of exaggerating the subtle differences to make them more apparent. Let's start by exaggerating the changes between rhythm and gesture, as if to highlight these differences to the audience's ear. For instance, the opening rise to the top, if played as written, sounds like this. If we exaggerate the gesture and direction of the rising theme and rising accompaniment, we get this. What I just did was add a small crescendo where there is none in the score, and I contoured this to match the harmonic progression. To do any more than this would run the risk of actually putting in a real crescendo, like this. This is arguably wrong, because it's definitely not in the score, and it ignores the possibility that Beethoven actually wanted it to stay soft, as a contradiction and surprise to regular music listeners. The point is that there is a limit if we're going to exaggerate something. We have to do it within the boundaries of the score so that we tread the line of what is written and what isn't. The first example was an exaggeration of the phrase shape, accompanied through dynamic change. When we consider that the subtleties of this phrase are also dominated by rhythmic change, then we must also try exaggerating the rhythmic differences between sections. The first few bars are long and drawn out in terms of rhythmic frequency in the melody. The second section is rather fast and quick. To exaggerate the differences between these two, we play around with our actual speed and our articulation. The long opening is played slightly slower, and the faster section is played slightly faster. In terms of articulation, the long opening bars are rather smooth and legato, with the second section having no legato or phrase markings of any kind. So, if we want to exaggerate this difference, then we simply play more legato than we would normally for the first section, and then play the second section semi-detached. Adjusting these changes so that none of them are too obvious or dramatic, we can come up with a final version which points out the structural and gestural differences to the audience without beating them over the head with it. This is a version which perhaps is most effective if the audience has never heard this piece before. musical cues is definitely a much easier task than communicating these cues in a subtle manner. Furthermore, the process of exaggeration is one which allows a much wider margin of error. If I exaggerate a phrase too much, it can be integrated into the performance as a stylistic singularity or as an interpretative marker of things to come. And of course, if I don't exaggerate it enough, I can just ramp up the adjustments later on and no one will notice. In other words, nothing will stick out as an oddity. Performing a work in a subtle manner, on the other hand, is difficult precisely because we have to perform perfectly in terms of control of sound. If a phrase is being played in a subtle manner, and all of a sudden we exaggerate one element of the music by accident, it sticks out to the audience, and they notice it and remember it. If this mistake occurs at a crucial moment, it can force a collapse of the previous phrase or ruin the transition to the next. Not surprisingly, it is for this reason that playing Mozart is outstandingly difficult. Musical phrasing in his music is all based on subtle musical cues, and if these are not refined, then the music can fail. Beethoven is not much different than Mozart, except that his average gestures are larger and are not necessarily confined to a 4 or 8 bar phrase. But if we choose to perform a phrase in a subtle manner in Beethoven, the same care must be applied as in Mozart. The opening legato phrase, if played in a neutral manner, as written in the score, sounds like this. To play this in a subtle manner, we simply shrink our exaggerated version down. I'll still play legato, but not as much as in the exaggerated version. I'll still put in a crescendo to the top of the phrase, but it will not be very significant, and the differences in articulation and speed between the long opening phrase and the second fast phrase will be a little more relaxed and less contrasting. This kind of performance tactic is one that can be used effectively if you know that your audience listens carefully to every nuance of performance. Rather than announcing to the audience, "Here is a new phrase," or "Here is a new character," you're simply turning your head slightly and winking an eye, because your audience is in on the joke that you're telling. This subtle style of performance has a very narrow margin of error. In the opening bars, we have a legato phrase in the piano dynamic. If I accidentally crescendo too much near the end of the phrase, it's blatantly obvious to the listener. If my articulation is bumpy during the fast notes, or if I don't play them evenly, it's very noticeable in a subtle interpretation. These are the kinds of elements that need to be controlled beyond any doubt. But if you manage it, then the results are refined and respected by not only audiences, but by our pianistic peers as well. For the sake of comparison, I'll give you now 2 versions of this opening. The first version is an exaggerated version. Now, here's the version that is subtle. extremes, to be fair, and many interpretations and performances fall within these extremes. I'm not going to declare which one is better or more effective. I'm of the belief that we have to decide these matters ourselves, depending on our own technique and our own musical intentions for the piece. The bottom line is that these decisions must be considered seriously because not all openings are created equal. The openings in this episode are rather easy when it comes to Beethoven. He establishes and reinforces the key, and he clearly defines the character of the piece as being either extravagant or introverted, and there is relatively no ambiguity. The only things we have to worry about involve how much we exaggerate the contrasts and how subtle we can be with our audience. These issues apply to all openings, regardless of their complexity, and they always form a baseline for our interpretation, no matter how many additional problems are added to these ones. So, until next time, keep practicing and experiment with exaggerating musical elements in your openings, and also toning those contrasts down to a subtle level. The more you experiment, the more options you can consider for your final interpretation. Bye for now.